So we can probably get started.
Sounds good.
So thanks for everybody who's on already. I want to welcome you to today's Improving Talk. Please post any questions you have via the Q&A tooling as we go. I'll try to get the questions to Tom. Otherwise, we'll have time at the end of the presentation as well. Tom Shiro, he's a senior consultant here with Improving. He's focused on data engineering, and he's going to be sharing with us his talk, Advanced Testing with Great Expectations. So with that said, over to you, Tom.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. So welcome to the presentation. Very excited to be giving this talk today. It has a lot of good information, and I think somebody that's new to DBT, somebody that has experience with DBT, and even somebody that is advanced can learn something from this presentation today. So I'm just going to go over the quick agenda today. The first thing I want to go over is my inspiration for this presentation. That's very important because it's a perspective not only from a client, it's also a perspective that we're seeing more in the industry as we move forward. And that's why these tools exist for testing and data quality. We're going to review the ETL process flow so that we get an understanding of how data moves within a database, how it actually gets to the database, and how it is used in reporting. It's important to go over that just because sometimes we have people from various backgrounds, and I want to make sure everybody is following along, even if they're not necessarily in the data space. We're going to go through common data quality tests. Of course, I'll go over DBT testing. I'm going to introduce great expectations, but in addition to that, I'm going to introduce a open source package. I'll explain that in a little bit, and then we're going to determine how to log executions and test results, and then we'll review and do a demo. So the first thing is, what was my inspiration for this topic? Basically, when I arrive at a client, a lot of times data quality and data testing, that can be functional tests, data quality test, schema test. There's a whole lot of tests that go into a data project. And eventually, we want to see that at an enterprise level. What I quickly realized, and everyone probably does when they see these diagrams, is realize that this is a project in itself. This is a big effort. And we don't want to wait to get there. We also don't want to introduce rework. But we want to be able to log issues. We want to build a framework, and we want something that can easily be upgraded later if needed, or something that's valuable today. And that's where I started to think about, I wanted to build something simple, effective, and valuable. I want it to be a solution that at least gives the idea of how to move forward to getting closer to our enterprise level observability, which is just basically all the log files from all your servers being centralized. And that way you can determine issues and errors and things like that and resolve them. I wanted to use only built-in functionality in open source projects. This is very important because I wanted to ensure that whether you're new to DBT, whether you're a mid-level developer, or whether you're an engineer with 20 years of experience, you would be confident in what I'm suggesting today. I want it to be easy to implement and manageable by all skills, low to no code. So that's very important. It's also important to know that even if what I'm presenting isn't exactly what you need, this setup can teach you, if you don't already know how, to build your own solution so you can basically learn from others' experience. So it's still valuable. So who am I? I'm Tom Shiro. I'm a senior consultant with Improving, as Daniel said. I've been a DBA, I've been a developer, a consultant, engineer. Right now, I would put myself more in that consultant role because I specialize in not only data pipelines, but I also work on team building and data modeling. That's my main focus for today in my career. So the ETL process flow. Let's go through that very quickly. So whether you're a data engineer, software engineer, it seems like we're always moving data around. All I'm illustrating here is that there's a source where data loaders pull the data in. There's an in-between, a Snowflake database. We'll be using Snowflake today for our presentation. And in Snowflake, there are various schemas. Those various schemas are usually raw, process, stage. You may have a data vault. You may have a delivery layer, depending on where you're at. And each stage or each schema within Snowflake, as the data lands and moves to its final destination to be consumed by reports, there's various tests that you put in each schema, and they may be redundant. You may do the same tests in raw that you do in process, but there's also specific tests that you might do in each schema. And then, of course, at the end, you want to ensure that you identify issues very quickly. So if something's wrong with the data in raw, you do not want that data to move to process, or you at least want to identify that as an issue that needs to be resolved. So within these schemas, typically a good framework to work from is you basically define what you're trying to accomplish by using that schema, what your expected outcomes are. You try to standardize naming conventions, column names, data types as much as you can, so that way you can ensure and identify tests that are appropriate for that schema level. And so going to common tests. So there's a lot here. The ones that are highlighted over to the left of the data quality test, and they have an asterisk, a yellow asterisk with it, that's what comes with DBT by default. So I will go over DBT in a second, but just know it's a transformation tool to move data throughout your data pipeline. And it's a configurable environment mostly, but you can also create your own scripts and SQL scripts and even Python scripts today to move the data along the pipeline. But those data quality tests come with the open source version of DBT. So you can test, should my column be null? How old is my data? I want to know how fresh it is. I want to ensure that I'm getting data on a timely basis. I can do unique tests, which is similar to primary key. But you just want to make sure that that value in that table is unique at all times. You can define relationships, much like foreign keys, and you can define accepted values within a range, for instance. So if you have something that you have a status column, and within that status column, it can either just be 1 or 0, you can test for that. And anyone that's dealt with data knows that just right there, there's a lot of value in those tests, and there's more, but that we'll go through. But those tests alone tell you things like, does the status start showing up null? Is it blank? You know, things like that. And that really does create problems in your data on down the line when you're reporting. There's a lot of other things that you might do for data quality. There's values in range. Test for outliers. I really like this one because if you see a sales order come in for, $10 million, it's probably a red flag saying that doesn't seem correct. You can even test. And we're going into different types of tests. So now we're just talking about tests in general. So the ones that are highlighted, that's DBT. The other tests are common tests that you would like to see happen. So valid country, state, or zip, valid phone number or phone number format, various thresholds. I really like this one because sometimes columns are defined as nullable, but that doesn't mean you want 90% of the columns to be null. That's an indication there's a problem. And those are two different tests. In addition, there's schema tests where I want to test the structure of my table. I want to understand what the primary keys are, what they should be, how the naming convention should be. Maybe you want to test row counts to ensure that there's a certain amount of row counts in a table. You can even test JSON and XML type schemas. You can test naming conventions, which I really like and is very beneficial for. And in project level within DBT, you can do governance checks and naming conventions. So we're going to go over a few of these tests, and I'll show how they work, and I'm going to show the options with some of the open source packages that I've chosen. So that way, if you maybe have the ability to do something in one open source package, you may have that same ability that works a little bit better and more preferable in another package. So let's go over DBT for a second, so everyone understands, like when I say package, test types, what DBT is. So again, DBT is a transformation tool. It's both an open source CLI as well as there's a cloud version. We're going to be using the cloud version today for our demo. Last week I gave the same talk, and I did that with the CLI version. So you can do both, no matter what version you have. So there are two different test types in DBT, and you create these tests, and they're usually SQL based. There's singular and generic tests. All that simply means is, am I writing a SQL test that does a specific task for specific data or model? Or am I creating a generic test where I can loop through every file in the entire project and do something specific? There are test properties. We're not going to go over those too much, but just know that when you run a test in DBT, you have the ability to store your results. You can also filter results. So you can say, for instance, if I just want to see if columns are nullable and there's 10 million rows that come in every day, maybe you just want to test the last day of data and find that those rows are unique or those are not null. You can do that as well. And tests can be defined at the column or table level. So this is very beneficial because some tests you not only want to define at the table level because it makes sense. Sometimes if you define it at the source or table level, that test flows through every table that is defined in your project. And I am going to go over what my DBT project looks like today. The next thing, so I was fixing this slide, so that's why it's a little busy right now. But what I want to go over is the distinction between grade expectations and DBT expectations. So first, DBT expectations over to the right, that is what we're going to use today. And there's a specific reason. So grade expectations overall is a company that has built an open source extended Python library used for testing. It's fantastic. It integrates with Snowflake, BigQuery, Airflow, Jupyter, Databricks, S3, Azure Blob Storage, a lot of different environments. And it works great. There's a little bit of learning curve with using grade expectations. So while there is a lot of benefit to getting your own grade expectations version, downloading it as a project, and working through learning that, again, the drive of this project was to see how much value can I derive without feeling that I have to learn a new tool. I want to use capabilities that are already in DBT because that's my main environment that I develop in. So DBT expectations is what we will be using. Understand that is a package in DBT that was created by, I don't know how you say this name, Logica, maybe. And that company created DBT expectations. I don't know what the package. I'm not sure if they're affiliated with the company Grade Expectations, but basically what they took was they took a lot of these libraries in Python that generate SQL, and they just simply modified them so you can run SQL. I'm not certain if every test in DBT expectations is also in Grade Expectations. I don't know. I do know there's functionality in the Grade Expectations Python library, such as checkpoints and honoring data contracts and test suites that are very valuable. We don't really have that in DBT expectations. Instead, we'll be using our framework to basically create the tests that we're going to create. very low learning curve. It's very easy to implement. If you've already done a DBT test, you can use this package as well. So the last open source project that I'm going to introduce, I do have a few others in the project, but I'm going to just point them out because I think they're a little more understandable. I'll point them out when I show the project. But basically, Brooklyn Data Company created an open source project called DBT Artifacts, and it helps you with monitoring pipelines. So it is really great because what it does is it basically builds you a mart of tables that are going to track your sources, your tests, your models, your execution times. So you will know your execution runtime, and you can understand, is my data growing? Is for some reason this pipeline slowing down or growing? Now, it's important to know that a lot of this functionality can be done with Airflow. And surprisingly, Airflow is very popular. And I've been at 2 clients that do not prefer to use Airflow for whatever reasons. And that led me to the idea that, okay, let me see if I can build something that I know everyone will understand. It's very easy to use, and it's just table driven. And so what is monitored? I went over that, the model executions, the snapshots, your tests, your seeds. You set this up to use as a DBT on run end hook, and I'll show that. And it reads your log files in your project to populate these tables. So it's really a fantastic idea. And along the same lines, it's important to know that between DBT and what you might learn on their website, between the DBT expectations open source package and what you learn from them, and what you learn from DBT artifacts, while each of those have their same benefits, it's important to know you can learn from what they've done in those projects and modify things so that way they meet your needs. So I'm going to go through a review very quickly, but the majority of the review is actually going to be when we look at the DBT project itself. So we now know tests that exist as a default in DBT. We know those are valuable, and I'll show you how to set those up if you're not familiar. But at the same time, that's a very standard way of setting up tests in DBT. We're going to extend our test capabilities and the number of tests we have right out of the box by including the Great Expectations package, DBT expectations, sorry, package in DBT. We're also going to determine how we can log our model executions and our test results. So that way we have a centralized location to either report from or eventually notify various people. So it's demo time. So that's pretty good. 23 minutes, not bad. That leaves a lot of time for a demo. And so this is DBT Cloud. This is our environment. I'm going to just quickly go over what the project looks like. I'm going to start with packages.yaml. So in packages.yaml, this is where you would define the packages you would like to have in your project. So you can see here, there's a date, open source package, basically, that allows you to quickly modify a date to a date timestamp using one particular function. Is a lot more advanced than that, but this is really a default that I'm exploring. What our main interest is DBT expectations. Again, here's our company that created it and our version. And this is what gives us additional libraries that are SQL based that we can apply towards our data warehouse, our raw, process, and staging schemas. And this package right here is an additional thing. I've already given a presentation on this package, but it's a wonderful tool, DBT Vault. It allows you to create your data vault using standard configurations, and it kind of works almost like an assembly line. Enter in this information and you build your stage. Enter in this information, you build your hub. So if you're familiar with Data Vault and you haven't seen that yet, it's definitely something worth checking out. DBT constraints that test your primary and foreign keys that are defined in your project. DBT utils that's used throughout, that's comes by DBT, a lot of good utilities in there. And here's your DBT artifacts. So that's what we have as far as packages that we're going to use today. Our main focus will be DBT artifacts and DBT expectations. When we look at our project file very quickly, we can just see that it's a typical project file. There's a few definitions in here, your variables to set the time zone. But other than that, you're just setting your model name, your schemas, whether you're creating a table or a view. You also see here, this is where I added a pre-hook for project governance. We'll go through that, and I'll show you how that works. And I showed that as a pre-hook in all the schemas. And I think that's at the end. Oh, here's where DBT artifacts is defined. It's defined as a model. So it's a package that actually implements a model as well. And I'll show you that. And on run end, we'll see there's two things here. The first is DBT artifacts upload results. So that is what we're given by our open source project. This is a modification to the same idea that I created. And I'm not sure why DBT artifacts didn't include the error message in all the information they retrieve from the log files. It's possible that it was defined differently at a later time. I'm certain based on what they've done already, they had more than enough skill to add the error message anytime they wanted. So just know that all I'm doing here is basically tracking the error. And that's a good indication that I can take what another company has done, open source examples, and modify it to what I would like very slightly. So it's, again, it's still low code. Let's go through the models real quick. So in our models, you can see that I've named each of the majority of the folders based on the schema, raw, process, staging. You'll see in DBT, there's a failures.sql that relates to my log DBT results that I made. So there's various information like that. The audit schema is actually our data vault. And we're going to go through, for the most part, we're going to go through each schema. And to not run out of time, just so everyone's aware, I'm going to spend the majority of time up front and defining what we're doing at the very first step. And then I'll slowly speed up through the other schemas until we get to the end, because I think we get the majority of the knowledge from the very first set of tests that we run. And I will also show some custom macros that I've created. So log governance results and parse DBT results. I'm sorry, parse DBT results and log DBT results. That's part of DBT artifacts. And you can see I just created a log governance results, used the same information, added another column that's extracted from a JSON document, and basically added that to a table. I also have a primary key validation and this project governance check, which I will show you how that works in a little bit. So I think that's an overview of basically the project. That's a lot to get if maybe you're new to DBT, but so watch this video. But if you are familiar with DBT, I think this will be really great to just see how everything is set up. So in a project, when we're thinking about schemas, we're thinking that there's always a landing space. Some people call it landing, some people call it drop, some people call it raw. I've called it raw here. And in here, there is a schema.yaml file, okay? So if we look at that, this is a pretty simple definition of just what our table structures look like. So that way, and some people skip this step or they just put the table name. Here's the benefit of listing out the table name and your columns in the schema and really defining that. So what this does is, let's imagine that data lands in raw today. And 2 weeks from now, we haven't seen any data. So there's a command, and actually I'm going to run this from the job so we can see that a little bit better. There is a command that you can run, dbt source freshness, that will, actually I'll just run it here, dbt source freshness. And what this does is it goes out to your sources, and I'll run this right now. It goes out to your sources and determines, how old your data is. And you can configure that in your raw schema.yaml using, so you can see I have some sources that are outdated. So it says dbt source failed. And if you look in here, probably going to say the data is stale. So this is typically what you would run at your first step of a dbt run when you start to process your data. And I really like that. You know, it's an easy command, but there's something to know about that command in general. That command does not actually constitute a run, which means you're not really able to log the results, even though dbt cloud can collect the results, even though you can see them manually in your log file. And if you were to run a job, you can definitely see the error or maybe notify someone. But again, the idea is a centralized location where I can go to one report and see all the activity or all the errors that I'm having in my pipelines. So I really do like this, but it's an option, but this source freshness is not quite there. So if we were to look at a few other things, let's look at this right here. This load date timestamp, it is now referencing the dbt expectations package and expects rows to have recent data. And I've set this obviously to be, 10,000 days old. That's probably not the best, but it still kind of, relates to the fact that dbt expectations allows you to test on one particular column. And the downside is you have to do that, set up something like this for each table individually on the load date timestamp. However, let's see what this actually does in Snowflake when I run an actual test. So I'm going to go to Snowflake right now, and I'm going to truncate, make sure that there's no data in these tables, so we can see that it's actually being created. And come on. Yeah. Right. There we go. I'm just going to pull that down a little bit to help me out. So I'm going to go back to dbt model, and I'm going to issue a different command. dbt test select tag source. Sorry, I think it's actually source sales demo. So now I'm going to run tests on sales demo. Keep in mind, I'm not even certain if it's going to fail or not. I'm not even worried about it because I will probably force some errors as we go. But let's look at what it's doing here. It's running through and doing all the tests. Those are defined in our schema.yaml file. And let's look at some of the results. So if we look at, for instance, sources, let's see what we find there. Oops. Oh. So if we look at sources, and I'll show you these tables. So I'm going to show you where dbt artifacts comes into this. So all these tables that I just truncated, not all of them, but most of them, other than failures and governance test errors, these are all the tables that DBT artifacts creates for you. And what I'm showing below is we automatically got our node ID. We got when the run started, what schema it was against, the source name, and what model it went against, which is in this case, the same as the identifier. And it's based on the load date timestamp, and it has the definition of your source freshness. So that is really, really beneficial. So you understand how you might, for instance, determine by this that I don't have any tests in a particular model, or I don't have the same tests in every model. So this is a great way to just, build some type of project framework where you always implement certain tests. So it's very important to think about that. You can also look at at tests, and you'll see that in here, it has the test that was ran, and you can see what it's actually testing. That is not null, that the process customer is not null for that particular column. It's not very defined very well. Keep in mind, we can eventually pull in descriptions or better ways of pulling in this data. So, but that is a limitation on the way the JSON is created in DBT and how you extract those values. At the end of the day, we could put on top of this a view or something that formats this data a little bit better, tells you what package is running, what your model path is. So you can see process schema was created, was used, stage schema, and the data vault schema. So you see in each schema, I define my own set of tests within each schema. So that's important as well. The idea behind testing is build the framework, insist on 1 or 2 tests per model, and just go with that. And then once you start implementing those data quality tests, it'll start to become normal for the project, because it always seems like it's an afterthought. So now we have centralized logging. We've seen that there's an easier way when source freshness is created, that it actually will log the status of a lot of your sources and things like that. So that's an alternative to your test failures and things like that. So, and keep in mind, just so you know, I had the test set up so it failed the first time. The reason we're not looking at an actual error, which might be beneficial if I just do this, let's just real quick, let's just change this to a minute so we can actually see that the test is logged. That's a much better way to go about it. I don't necessarily like the error message, but it's something. All right, so we'll do DBT test, select, tag, no, that's not right, source, sales, demo. All right, let's see if that runs and kicks off. So as that's running, I'm going to start to set up some other tests that we're looking at. So remember how I mentioned the governance tests? So this governance test basically is used to test the naming conventions of your project. So this is a custom test I created, but again, it's all based on, I see how people in the industry, I see how DBT artifacts, I see how DBT expectations is building their framework. And I wanted to implement something that would test the actual naming conventions of my models. So go through that in a second. You can see here now, you can see that it's not very user-friendly, but you can see here is your error message that gets logged. Here's your unique ID. Here's the database, your schema, and DBT expectations. There's your test. Here's your test. Here's your fail. And there you go. That is at least identifying that there's a failure. Now, again, there's a lot more that would go on to this project. Naming conventions, things like that. You want to put an alias to the table name here. You might want to do that. But overall, we're logging errors. We're setting up our tests, and we're starting to work towards a centralized way of logging all our errors. So you can see there that it failed, as we would expect. And that is important because that is going to get logged in your DBT test executions. I'll show that real quick. Oops. So you see, these are all very valuable because eventually you can just have this in a Power BI report. And so rows affected, failures, I probably have to go all the way down to the bottom. There's our one failure for expected rows to have recent data. Okay, so we now know that works, and now we're getting tables, data errors logged in our actual database. So I'm going to change this real quick to day, and just put it back at. Sometimes if you don't do that when you're doing a demo, you'll start to see the errors start to happen. So the next thing I want to show is our models. So if I select from DBT models, there's our actual models and their name. So that gets automatically pulled in using DBT artifacts. So let's go and run a model. DBT run, select, tag, process. So now we're going to actually do the next step. So we're moving on from raw. We're pretending like everything was successful just for the purpose of the demo. And now we're going to test a few different things. So I will open the process schema. So if we go in here and we open up that process schema, you can see once again, I'm testing things like ensure that the combination of these two columns is unique. I want to ensure that this particular column is not null and this column is not null. And you can put as many as you want. What's really nice is you can test source freshness again. That's important because remember, data in raw doesn't necessarily mean it got to process or got to stage or got to its final destination. So a lot of these tests are so simple, you can copy and paste and add them to your next set of processes that you would like. There's also expected values. You can test your column count. You can ensure that at a minimum, this table has these two columns. So there's a lot going on here. And when you run this particular model, let's see what happens. So if I remember correctly, this should also run our governance tests first. Let's see if it does. It did not. So try to remember why that didn't work. Oh, it did run. Sorry. I'll get to that. The first thing to just know is you have models and models execution. You have various tests set up. And if anything failed, it would show up here. So that's the important part. So let's introduce some failures real quick, because we like to see things fail. Let's do this. Let me first go into the governed project macro. Let me go into there and I will set up a forced testing. So if we go here, if we go data governance check, if staging, I think if I just do this, I don't know, we'll just put something here. Okay, yeah, we'll just save that. And we run this tag again, but this time we're going to do a build because I want to see what happens, actually we'll run first. So, and I'll do a build next because that'll actually test things. It's important to know that this project governance check is not part of a test. I call it as part of a pre-hook. So, but it's very valuable. And what this does is it ensures that for all files that are in this particular directory, that it's named and prefixed a certain way. So stage underscore model name, things like that. So, and it does that for each of the models. It can be a file name. It can be a value in the file. It can be whatever you would like that has a certain .SQL, .txt, whatever. If there's a schema YAML file created for each of your schemas that are defined, you can do a lot of things like that. And in the DBT governance test, so now we just tested a project level test. And all this was based on information I learned from DBT expectations, DBT artifacts, and I'm just piecing it together to decide what I would like to do on my project. And you can see here that for this model, the model path is process customer info. And you can see that invalid naming convention, right? Now, keep in mind the error message didn't quite make it there just because I didn't change invalid naming convention. I didn't change the actual description. So we're going to show that that is a very simple test and framework to put together. That's another advantage of using DBT this way. And of course, there's many other ways to log this information, but this is one of them. And now I'm going to run DBT tests. So what I'm going to do in the essence of time, because I'm running out of time, I do want to take some questions. I'm just going to run a DBT test open, and let's just see what kind of errors we get. And so if I do DBT test, so I'm actually going to go in here and truncate all this. Should have did that before the test started, but I'm sure we'll still collect something. Because I want to show that, you know, each time this run happens, more and more rows are being created. And so still running the tests. And keep in mind, I truncated all that. We're going to probably start to see rows start to show up in sources, in test executions. We're going to start to see that possibly in failures and possibly governance tests. So there's a lot that we're going to collect here. And I also want to, let's see here, that's pretty good. So nothing really seems to error. That's fine. I probably reset everything, but you can see that I now have sources. I now have the tests and the test results back. So that's great. You now can see that your models and model executions are back. So you have all that information to report on again. And during a full rebuild, these tables will be rebuilt as well, and you can start the logging again. So the last thing I'm going to do is, at least with the demo, before I wrap it up, because I'm running out of time, there's a lot of information here, so I think I should have cut back the presentation a little bit. But if we go into models, and we go into bronze, and we go into audit, you'll see there's this raw vault and stage. Raw vault is where you're creating your data vault. It's where you define your hubs, your links, your satellites, your transaction links. So that is DBT Vault, great product. And decide if you can use it, that would be great if you find it valuable. And in addition, you can create your own data vault schema with files inside of this folder. And there's a few things that are a little bit different that happens in here. There's different tests that occur. So I'm expecting in every single table that the load date and the record source should exist. So you can see that I apply that at this particular level. It's also possible to put this in a different schema file and possibly do the test for every model that you've defined. So there's a lot of options there. And you'll see that I define the columns, okay, that are supposed to be there. I'm also defining values such as, I want this value to be unique, not null, and essentially a primary key. So I define all my hubs, all my links and satellites, and this is a little bit different. So this is using DBT constraints as a test. This is really interesting because DBT constraints as a package not only is another option for testing primary and foreign keys, it will create that structure in your database. So those that have used Snowflake realize that Snowflake doesn't honor a primary key, but it doesn't mean that you can't create one and then test against it and determine, is this value unique? Is it actually a primary key? And has that primary key been created? So I'm going to run a DBT test and do select, tag, audit. So that's our schema. So I'm going to run this twice because I want to show that errors really do show up. So the first thing this is going to do is, as we execute this, obviously it's going to be logged in DBT artifacts. So these tests will be logged there. I don't think I set up any failures, so I think it should be just fine. Everything will be successful. And what it's actually going to do is, maybe we can even look at the log file. I wonder if it's in there. We might be able to look at the log file and it'll show like that I'm not only doing these tests and running against them. Anyway, I won't look for it because it'll take too long, but keep in mind, it's physically creating that constraint in the database. So let's go here. Let me see if I can look for the constraints. I don't have it listed here, so I'm going to go to bronze, information schema, views. I think it's table constraints. Yeah, right here. And we'll go table constraints. Come on. Come on. All right. So if we go here. So far, everything's pretty much been working. So I have a feeling we're at the end here. Let's see if it works. Okay. So you can see here that the constraint name was created. Hub customer PK. And I put PK twice just to ensure that everyone knew it was a primary key. It's based on this table, primary key. There we go. You can do the same thing for foreign keys and various things like that. So the last thing I want to do in showing this and tie it all together is I'm going to run that same command again. This time, I'm going to just basically do that. So I know that that column doesn't exist. And that way we can see that we will log an error. We will see, you know, that actually it's DBT test, select, tag, audit. So it should probably fail fairly quickly. And then we can go look at those tests. And keep in mind, there is another run command called build, which build will do your tests, your snapshots, your seeds for the entire project or that particular tag or model that you have defined. So you can see that it errored, and we're almost at the end. Let's see if it proved me right. This information back in there. So we have our test back in there. Remember, just before I ran that, I created, should be here somewhere. Okay, we got a null for some reason. Okay, I'm not sure why. Let's see if I actually logged the error. And so I did log the error. I'm not sure why the count. Oh, probably just because it's a different type of test. So, but basically you can see here, order PK1, it does not exist. And there's your error. So unique, and here's what you were trying to test. So I am going to wrap it up here because I want, well, 5 minutes. I guess I can talk a lot. So I want to wrap it up here to just kind of summarize what we've seen. So everything I implemented is at my skill level. It's really great if somebody's new to DBT. It's information of maybe what they would want to build, and it's a perfect kind of project to show you how everything works in DBT. And if you have a general skill level as a developer, you easily understood this. And if you're a seasoned engineer with 10 years of programming experience and different things like that, and you understand test-driven development, you can expand on this idea to make it your own even more. So I think this is a great piece of information that everybody can learn from, and you don't have to necessarily implement it. You can just see if it works for your particular company. But what we have here is we have DBT expectations that was created by a company. It's a package that fits in DBT. It provides you a lot of different ways to test your data. So you can see here, you can see if I can find it. That's DBT artifacts. Let me see if I can show you a few tests as well. Tests, it must be on backlist. So you have math tests. You have regex tests. You have schema tests. There's a lot going on there. And you have obviously your utils. So there's a lot that you can derive from there, and a lot of knowledge that you can reuse for your own particular tests. We have a package, DBT constraints, which allows us to not only test for primary and foreign key constraints, it will set that foreign key constraint, and you can define exactly what that naming convention should be. You can test for that as well. We've seen project level tests that basically go out and ensure that you have correct naming conventions and things like that. You can test a lot of other things. You can make sure that a schema YAML file is in each of your folders. And we also saw DBT artifacts, which when you run a test, when you run a source freshness, when you run a model, or you do a full rebuild, all that information gets logged back into your database and allows you to report on it. So that wraps up this presentation. Are there any questions? Hopefully you could hear me the whole time, Daniel. It was very quiet out there.
Yeah, no, you definitely were coming through clear. There aren't any questions at the moment. Are there any sort of frequently asked questions you typically get, or anything you want to call out?
Yeah, I think one of the questions I get is, how long does this take? If I wanted to set this up for a client and I just wanted to mimic exactly what was done here and present on it, how long would it take? I think I set this up in, I don't know, I want to say maybe 10 hours and did various testing. It did not take very long. And keep in mind, there was no project to start from. The only thing I did have was the data that already existed. I would expect that the data setup could take a little bit more time. I already had Snowflake set up. And then I just moved from the CLI to DBT Cloud. And that was a seamless transition. So not a big deal at all. I think this is a great way that the other question I have is, how can you learn from this? Because a lot of people want to take this into their own hands and implement it at their client site, or possibly, at their work. And it's very easy to get started. You can go to DBT Hub and you can see how all these packages are defined. It will give you instructions on how to set it up. And once you set up those packages and you just execute any single model, no matter how basic it is, you will start to understand how the framework works. So it's very valuable from that. I think those that want to get started or use this as a learning tool for your company, that is also beneficial. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Tom, thank you for sharing, and thank you for everybody who attended this week's Improving Talk. For those on the call, feel free to join us next week as we dive into microservices. And be sure to check out our website where we have a full list of upcoming talks. We are improving. Hope that you have an excellent rest of your day as well as your week.
All right. Thank you.